Hi everyone. In this lesson I want to talk about how you factor the sum or difference of cubes. Now this is one factorization that you really pretty much have to just memorize the basic form. It's difficult to try and guess by just trial and error like we do when we factor trinomials. But when we memorize the form, once you understand how it works, it's not that hard to remember and it's fairly easy to apply. So if I have the sum of cubes, x cubed plus y cubed, the first thing you want to remember is that out of x cubed plus y cubed, you can factor an x plus a y. And if you had x cubed minus y cubed, you could factor out an x minus y. So you want to remember that out of x cubed plus y cubed, the sum of cubes, you factor out x plus y, and then you're left with a trinomial. And the same thing, when you factor out of x cubed minus y cubed x minus y, you're also left with a trinomial. All right? And the hard part is really remembering what this trinomial is. What I remember is that each of these factorizations has one minus sign in it. Okay? So if I factor out an x plus y, I end up with the minus sign right here, x squared minus xy plus y squared. And if I factor out an x minus y, since I've already used up the one minus sign there is, I know that these are both going to be plus. Okay? And this other factor, this trinomial, what you'll notice is going to equal this term right here squared, and then this term times this term. Now that kind of reminds us of a perfect square. If I doubled it, there'd be a 2 right here, and then this would be a perfect square. So this is almost a perfect square, but there's no 2 right here. All right? And so, and then this term right here, the y squared is just this right here, this number right here squared. And it's the exact same pattern that we have down here. It just has a different sign. All right? So however you want to memorize that, the way you want to think about it really isn't in terms of x's and y's. I like to think of it more in terms of a first something and a second something. So if you're going to factor out, you have something cubed plus something cubed, or something cubed minus something cubed. For example, down here, and I'll just use this to illustrate, I have x cubed minus 8 and I want to factor that. The first step is to think of this as x cubed minus 2 cubed. So my first something is x and my second something is 2. And I can factor out of that the first something, in this case plus, it would be plus the second something. Or here, the first something minus the second something. Okay? So down here I'm going to factor out of this an x minus a 2. And then I'm left with this trinomial. And the trinomial that I'm left with here, if I factor out the first something minus the second something, is the first something squared. It's going to be this number here squared. And then I'm going to have this number times this number, and I add it because I've already used my one minus sign there. So I'll have the first something times the second something. And then I'll have this other second something right here squared. Okay, so down here I'm going to end up with my first something squared, and then it's going to be plus my first something x times my second something 2, and then I'll have my second something 2 squared. Okay, and so that would give me, I want to simplify this, x minus 2 times x squared plus 2x plus 4. Now notice that because there's no 2 up here, that's not going to factor. This trinomial that's left over, unless you forgot to factor out something in common up here, is never going to factor. So notice down here, this we'll often be tempted and we'll wonder if that's going to factor, but it's not going to factor unless we missed factoring something out earlier. Okay, so here I have 27 plus 8t cubed, and the first thing you want to recognize is that 27 is a perfect cubed. I want to think of this as 3 cubed, and then 8t cubed is a perfect cube. I want to think of that not as just t cubed, but I want to think of it as the quantity 2t cubed. So I've got something cubed plus something cubed. And I'm going to want to use this pattern right here, the same as this one up here, so I can factor out of that the first something plus the second something. I can factor out of that the 3 plus the 2t, and then I'm left with a trinomial, and the trinomial that's left is going to be the first something squared, and then I have my minus sign, and then I have the first something times the second something plus the second something squared. Okay, so I'm going to have down here I'm actually just going to forget looking at this up here. I'm going to look right at this point. My first something is 3. I'm going to square that. And I need my minus sign because there's one minus sign here. And then I take my first something times my second something. And then I'm going to add my second something squared. Okay, so from there I would just simplify this. I get 3 plus 2t. And then the trinomial is 9 minus 6t plus 4t squared. All right. Now I can and probably should, especially when I'm first learning this, check and make sure that I didn't make a mistake. And that's fairly easy to multiply back out, right? If I were to multiply this out, I would get, well, x times x is x cubed, and this x times 2x is 2x squared. And this x times 4 is 4x. Then when I do the negative 2, this negative 2 times the x squared, that's really nice. See, it cancels that. And then this negative 2 times the 2x is negative 4x, and that cancels that. And the negative 2 times the 4 is negative 8. So if I multiply these out, it really does give me what I started with. Okay, and you can check these others as well. So let's go ahead and look at another example here. This example has a common factor of 2 that I want to factor out first. And I'm left with y cubed minus 64. Now, again, you want to recognize that 64 is a perfect cube. In fact, what you should know, what you should have in mind, and whenever you're dealing with cubes in math, there's really not that many cubes you need to know. You should certainly know that 1 cubed is 1, and 2 cubed is 8, and 3 cubed is 27, and 4 cubed is 64, and 5 cubed is 125. Okay, and it's very rare that you'll see any other problems in algebra where the cube, you have a cube that's bigger than that. So what I'm saying here is that when you see the number 64 in the context of like cubes, you want to think of that as 4 cubed. Now if I was in the context of squares, I'd want to think of that as 8 squared, not 4 cubed. Okay, so let's go ahead and I can factor this. I've got 2 times y cubed minus 4 cubed. So I want to think of my second something as 4. And then I'm going to factor out of that y minus 4. And then I'll be left with my first something squared. And then it's going to be plus my first something times my second something. That'll be 4y. And then another plus, because I've already used my 1 minus sign here. And then I'll have my second something squared, which is 16. I can factor it just like that. Okay. One last problem. Again, 125, I should recognize right away that that is a perfect cube. 8's a perfect cube. Actually, c to the 6 is a perfect cube. So my first step here is to think of this as 5c squared, that whole quantity cubed, and then minus 2d squared, and that quantity cubed, right? So if I cube the 5, I get 125. If I cube the c squared times c squared times c squared will give you c to the 6. So I have something cubed minus something cubed. I want to factor out of that the first something, 5c squared, minus the second something, 2d squared. And then I'm going to quit looking up here. I'm going to look right here. My trinomial that's left here is my first something squared. I already used my minus sign, so let's put a plus right here. And then I'll have my first something times my second something. Don't double it like we do when I'm scoring binomials. Okay, so multiply this times this, and then add your second something, but you have to square it. Okay, so that's going to give me 5c squared minus 2d squared, and what I'm left with here is 25 c to the fourth. I'll get 10 c squared d squared, and here I'll get 4 d to the fourth. Okay.